Thank you, Bill. Yeah, I think that the book is as timely now as it was when it was written during World War II. We live in an age of polarity. We all understand that. Polarity is not a bad thing. It's an analogy, and it comes from the idea of living in a world where there are two poles. Those are real places. Consequently, if we have poles apart and are thinking about something, that's okay. That's a place of engagement, and we can engage and talk. The ancient Greeks had a concept. They used the words men on the one hand, de on the other hand, and they would talk about the dialectic, the trivium out of which the liberal arts education grew, had grammar, learning the use of words and how they work. Then it had the dialectic, learning how to logically debate from poles apart, from different points of view. And then you had rhetoric, learning how to say things well. Well, unfortunately, we have moved in our age no longer to respect polarity, but polarization. And polarization digs in at our pole and discounts any other point of view. And C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man won't allow us to do that. Lewis actually felt it was one of his 3 best books of the 73 books that are under his name. And consequently, we see in this book, as Lewis helps us to learn how to think through issues and then to debate them well, that basically Lewis was an objectivist. He believed that there were objects that existed, whether they be material objects or whether they be objects of thought set apart by definition, and from which we could reason inferentially in order to understand more robustly a particular topic. So there are objects and there are subjects. There are knowers, people who can engage with those objects and begin to understand them. And we don't do this in isolation. We do this in community. So we could then debate. You've all heard the poem by John Godfrey Sachs, The Six Blind Men and the Elephant. They come upon an elephant. They've had no experience with one. They've heard them before, but they're blind. One grabs a leg and says, oh, an elephant's like a tree trunk. Another one's bumping up against the side, says, no, it's like a wall. Another one has hold of the tail, says, no, it's like a rope. Another one has hold of the trunk. He says, no, it's like an anaconda snake. And they're debating. They have real empirical experience of the elephant, but they benefit in a robust understanding of the elephant if they could begin to trust one another. They begin to make their way around the elephant and include the others, and all of a sudden good things occur. But there's an object that's there, the elephant itself. Now, the problem is some people think that Lewis's understanding of this subjective knowing and the objective having an item to know about, again, an object of thought or an empirical object, they think that's Enlightenment rationalism, and that is not true. Lewis's objectivity confused Enlightenment rationalism. Lewis's ideas go far, far further back. Lewis, Lewis is rooted in classical thought. He was trained as a medievalist. He understands scholastic understanding of knowledge and epistemology. And in ancient times, people believed that there was a check and balance on how a person knows anything. You have reason as a way of knowing. You have authority. We can hear from a person we trust. And we have experience. These 3 have to be in sync if we hope to have any kind of epistemological validation. We see this in the Apology by Plato, where Socrates is giving his defense before the court of Athens, and he appeals to authority, reason, and experience. We who know our Bibles, we realize that that's what's going on in the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. If you read through that carefully, you'll see that the entire argument is based on authority, what the apostles have had an experience with, experience itself. They appeal to the word of God as authority as well. And then also James stands up and puts it together in a reasonable way. Authority, reason, experience. Years ago, I had wonderful opportunities to meet for lunch with Mortimer Adler, the philosopher at the University of Chicago. He was the editor of the Great Books of the Western World, and he was the editor of the last edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. One time he told me over lunch that he thought that the Cartesian and Enlightenment philosophers and the empirical philosophers were ignorant men. As soon as he said that, I about leapt out of my chair. I said, what do you mean they're ignorant? These were brilliant men. He says, oh, I didn't say they were unintelligent. He said, I said they were ignorant. I don't think they had read more than 2 generations before their own time. Or had they read Plato and Aristotle, had they read the scholastics, they wouldn't have made the mistakes they did. But they severed themselves from the past. And consequently, as a result of that, they made their mistakes. Lewis's objectivity is deeper and richer. It's magic from before the dawn of time. It's very early on. Matter of fact, I would say it's the way God wired us to approach things and think about things. So the occasion for the book, the Abolition of Man, a book that I think if we're associated with, again, one of Lewis's 3 best books, he thought, by his own assessment, I think it will help us from falling into some of the Enlightenment traps and certainly some of the traps that are going on in our age of polarization. The occasion for the book, Lewis was concerned about subjectivity, where not in any way opposed to the subjective, but it always has to be the subjective that grasps its understanding in the context of objects. And Lewis saw this thing called subjectivism, where the subject asserted its perspective without any necessary concern about whether or not their understanding was validated by an objective reality. So Lewis he wrote this essay, The Poison of Subjectivism. He saw that evil can be validated and justified subjectively when it becomes untethered from reality. And then also, Lewis had received a book in the mail to do a book review on. Now, when Lewis would do a book review, if it got a good review, you'd get extra sales of the book. I don't think he was as popular as Oprah is. Oprah endorses a book and 20,000 people go out and buy it. I wish you would endorse the neglected C.S. Lewis, but nevertheless, this book was called The Control of Language by Alec King and Martin Ketley. It was written for grammar for 6th form students in England. That would be equivalent to junior and senior years in high school. And he simply calls it the Green Book in the Abolition of Man, and he calls the authors Gaius and Titius. He had no interest in embarrassing them. But he sees that this book has embedded in it subjectivism, and Lewis is deeply concerned about it. And consequently, he begins to deconstruct the philosophy embedded in this book long before there were any postmodernists who told us that deconstruction is the thing that we should be doing. So he's looking for these embedded assumptions in this book. And he gave 3 lectures then at the University of Durham, as KJ said earlier, in 1943. And the 3 lectures end up becoming the 3 chapters of this book. And the first chapter, Lewis sets forth his case. He calls it Men Without Chests, Men Without Sentiments, men who think that you can have emotion that can be valid but separated from any kind of reality. He begins by telling a story. It's about Coleridge at a waterfall. I looked for 15 years before I finally found the story. I would ask, somebody says I'm fading in and out. I don't know what to do about it, actually. Is that any better? I'll get closer to the computer. Maybe that'll help. But anyway, I asked academics at Oxford, where's this from? Where's this from? It took me 15 years to find out that the story is an account given in Dorothy Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, the poet's sister, called Grasmere Journals, 1803. She talks about the time when Coleridge was at a waterfall. It was actually the Coralline waterfall on the River Clyde. I've actually been there to see it. It's a beautiful place. And there were 2 other tourists there when Coleridge was there, and one of them called the waterfall pretty. The other one called it sublime. And Coleridge mentally endorsed the one who called it sublime. This waterfall is not merely pretty. It almost approximates the Platonic ideal of what beautiful is. And so I drew a little picture. I'm such a low-tech guy. Here's my picture. You got Coleridge at the waterfall. You got the one guy who says it's pretty. You got the other one who says it's sublime. And Coleridge endorsing the one. The waterfall is the object. The statements are subjective. And they're only meaningful if there's an object that can support the claim. If I say this is a cell phone right here, that's true because there's a real object in my hand that somebody says I should increase my volume in my laptop microphone. I don't know how to do that. I'm so sorry. Let me see what I can do. Everything is up as high as it'll go. Please forgive me, people. I don't know. Let me just check real quick and see if there's anything else here I can do.
It's probably all you can do, Jerry. Right now, those who are suggesting the headset, we're not with him, so we're going to have to press with what we have.
So some say they can hear it's just fine, but I'm so sorry. Anyway, let me go back though. So if I say that's a cell phone, it's true because there's a cell phone there. There's an objective reality to validate the claim. But if I say this is an elephant, that's false. All false statements have nothing to validate them. There may be elephants in the world, but that's not one. So consequently, a false statement is invalid by virtue of the fact that there's no objective reality that supports the claim. So what Coleridge, what Gaius and Titius in the Green Book do is they say Coleridge had no right to make that judgment. For the tourists were saying anything at all about the waterfall, they're only saying something about their own feelings. So here it is. The authors of the Green Book draw a line between what the people say and what actually is there, saying that what is there is irrelevant to the claim. Lewis goes nuts with this. And the reason why is multiple reasons, actually. First off, they begin to say that they're just talking about their emotions, their sentiments, and consequently it has nothing to do with the waterfall itself. Well, Lewis suggests that means then they're thinking that sentiments in any way are not necessarily true or false. You couldn't have just or unjust sentiments. He actually quotes Thomas Traherne. He quotes Augustine's Ordo Amoris, ordered loves. You should give to each thing the proper level of love or sentiment, emotional response that it is due. And if you don't do this, you're unjust. I can give you an example. If you go to a birthday party, it's not good if you show up and you're morose. Matter of fact, let's say you're going to the birthday party and you get a phone call from a friend on your way and find out another friend of yours was hurt in an automobile accident. You're deeply concerned. I would call the friend whose birthday it is and say, something's come up, I'll tell you about it later. I won't be able to be there. Please forgive me. And you go to the hospital to see that friend, but you don't go bring your moroseness or your sorrow to the birthday party and throw a damper on that person's time of celebration. If you show up at the birthday party, you should be joyful. That's appropriate to that setting. It's objectively affirming. The subject is getting its lead from the object. If you go to a funeral, you shouldn't be giddy unless you owed the guy that died a lot of money. Maybe then there's a reason for your happiness. But the bottom line is, if you go to the funeral, you should be sober. The person may be a believer, and that may be well and good. But the interesting thing about it is, you're at the funeral and you're recognizing the same sorts of things that motivated Jesus to weep at Lazarus' tomb, fully knowing he was going to raise him from the dead a few minutes later. So Gaius and Titius say that they were just saying something about their feelings, and their feelings didn't in any way have any kind of subjective justice in relationship to the thing that was itself. And secondly, Lewis recognizes at this particular point, Gaius and Titius become subjectivists. They imply that objective reality is an irrelevancy. And Lewis picks up on that. He says if there's no objective reality, we're left with self-referentialism. What I feel is all that matters, whether it accords with any other thing. What I think, if I try to assert a judgment, it has no meaning if there is no objective reality that supports the claim. What you end up having is the potential for anarchy of thought. You also then potentially could have groupthink. If I get people who join in anarchy. And then if we ascend to power, you have tyranny. We see a lot of that going on today too. Lewis warns against this in The Abolition of Man. Lewis says in De Futilitate, all judgments imply a standard. All judgments imply a standard. If I don't have a standard for making the judgment, then I'm better off not judging. I'll talk more about that when I apply what Lewis argued to the concept of beauty in a few minutes. So then he introduces this concept called the Tao, or Tao, if you prefer. He uses an Eastern word because he wants to show that what he's talking about is not merely a Western idea. It's a universal idea. As a matter of fact, Lewis has an appendix at the end of the book where he draws from a wide swath of various cultures over all history. And he shows how people were concerned about the issue of objective reality. And he defines the Tao as the doctrine of objective reality, the belief that certain things are really true or really false to the kinds of things we are and the kinds of things the universe is. Lewis says you do not want to divorce your thinking from reality, or you end up in subjectivism. And if you then begin to coerce other people to embrace your point of view, it could lead to very unsavory practices. We see this sort of thing going on today. And Lewis quotes, again, all these sources at the end of the book that basically show this is not merely a Western idea. Furthermore, Lewis is concerned that the authors of the Green Book, having removed the basis for sound judgment, they persist in making them. What's the basis for their judgment? If Coleridge has no right to judge between the two tourists who one said pretty and the other one said sublime, both were making positive statements about the waterfall. But Coleridge thought that the one who said sublime was a more robust explanation, captured with greater degree of justice. Justice is to render to a thing its due. A greater degree of justice, the beauty of the waterfall itself. And so if they say Coleridge has no right to make his judgment, by what right do they judge Coleridge? And here's where now we end up into a kind of tyranny. The fact that they judge him is a prelude to this tyranny. And Lewis ends this chapter, chapter 1, called Men Without Chests. In other words, we're going to destroy the sentiment. You destroy the organ, motive feature and that proper subjective thing that will respond properly to the objective reality. You destroy the organ, but you demand the function. He says it's like castrating and then bidding the geldings be fruitful. We laugh at honor and then we're surprised to find traitors in our midst. We laugh at objective reality and then we can't cope with the subjectivism, the anarchy, and eventually the tyranny that follows in its wake. No, there must be some standard, and that standard can be discovered. Clarity without polarization that says my way is the only way. So he moves into the second chapter, chapter 2. It's called The Way. And Lewis observes rightly that if Coleridge is being judged by the authors of the Green Book, by what standard might they be judging? And he says they might be judging by something like this. And he said maybe they're using utilitarianism, the philosophy of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham and so on. And Lewis says the thing about utilitarianism is we say we're going to do what's best for the greatest number, which means there's going to be a minority that has to suffer. Who determines who that minority is? Do they suffer by the mere basis that they're minority? We all know times when there have been minority who have suffered because the majority have been, as history has shown, wrong and also vicious. Who determines? And without something greater than utility, you won't be able to discover that. Lewis says you need objective reality. You need the Tao. He says another thing they might substitute with is instinct. But Lewis says instinct is a bad approach to judgments because instincts are at war. I may have an instinct that tells me I'm tired. I may have an instinct that tells me I'm hungry. I may have an instinct that tells me I need to go to the bathroom. I may have an instinct that tells me I need to get up and go to work so I can pay my bills. But instincts are at war. How do I determine which instinct should be followed at this particular moment unless I have something that transcends instinct itself? He's the problem. He also says, well, how about economic value? Some people could say it's economic value. But we all know people who have made a lot of money and they've used the mere pursuit of economics to justify all kinds of bad behaviors. Not everybody who makes money is bad. You hear the stuff with Bernie Sanders where he says 1% of Americans have 90% of American resources. Nobody ever questions him about it. Why? Because we don't think objectively. What do you think that 1% is doing with that money? You think they have it stuffed in their mattresses? Or do you think by virtue of their entrepreneurial skills, they're creating capital and they're creating jobs and giving jobs to people so those people can work and pay for their families and so on, be taxed if you need money for the government, you get greater tax base because of that. No, nobody asks about that. So they say economics. It's true people have abused with economics. But it's also true that people have used economics as a means to destroy people. You have the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, if you studied that horrible atrocity, where they were going to somehow generate everybody as a worker, and all of their programs failed. And they weren't producing the food, so they decided to send soldiers into villages and kill them for economic reasons. Finally, they couldn't produce enough bullets for them to kill the people, so they issued clubs and had them beat the people to death. Finally, their soldiers got so weary they had to have vacation days where they would issue bullets. Economics is a bad basis. Economics goes on, but its movements have to be judged by something higher, something like the Tao. And so Lewis recognizes that Christians themselves, in another book, the Reflections on the Psalms, Lewis recognizes even Christians could somehow do this. We could mask our subjectivism. He says in Reflections on the Psalms, the worst bad people are religious bad people. The quicker I might be willing to die for my faith, maybe the quicker I'd be willing to kill for my faith. Or paint a thus saith the Lord across my opinions, and consequently make my word equal with God's word. Have you ever heard people hold up a Bible after they've taught it and they said, I'm not telling you this. This is the word of God. I believe the Bible is inerrant in the original autographs. I am so squeaky conservative in my view of Scripture. But what Scripture is inerrant? The pre-interpreted text or the post-interpreted text? Clearly, we don't extend the doctrine of inerrancy to our interpretation. If that's the case, then it's almost like we make our word equal with God's word. I think it's borderline blasphemy. And I think we can do this, and it ends up into a kind of subjectivism that can become tyrannical. Thomas Aquinas said, however, that an abuse does not nullify a proper use. Lewis quotes this several different places in his writings. An abuse does not nullify a proper use. If you judge any segment of society by its worst examples, nobody could stand. Nobody. So consequently, we need to recognize that we need to try to get to objective reality, and I would suggest to get to objective reality in community if we're going to understand that reality and how we should respond to it properly, whether that response is emotional, sentiments, volitional, by our choices, by our reason as we think about it, and even by our morality and our moral choices. And so Lewis says that we want to obey these absolute values as best we might, as best we can understand them. He says there can be development within the Tao. He says, you like your vegetables fresh? Why not grow them in your own garden and have them perfectly fresh? So you move from fresh vegetables to fresh grown vegetables right out of your own garden. He says, but that's different than saying, forget vegetables, just eat bricks and centipedes instead. That's not development. Development with him. We see this in the scriptures as well, by the way. When the law is given and the children of Israel are told how the property will be distributed in the book of Numbers, there are these 5 women who say to Moses, we don't think this is fair, just after Moses gave them the word of God. And Moses, if I was there, I would have backed away because the ground was known to swallow some people up at that time. But Moses, to his credit, says these women, make your case. They were the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. They said our father had 5 daughters, no sons. The way this thing is described, all of his legacy will go to our uncle's sons, our cousins, and our father's legacy will be lost. Moses says that's an interesting application. Let me find out. He goes and prays to God, and God says the daughters of Zelophehad are right. So here is an objective law that's given by God himself, and God praises the people who think more robustly about it to enrich the possible applications of that particular law. That's well within the bounds of what Lewis would call the Tao or the Tao. In chapter 3, he talks about the abolition of man. What happens to the society that rejects objective value? And we're going to talk about how that could be applied to moral issues in a few minutes when we apply his argument to both beauty and to morality. What happens to society that rejects objective value? He says the Tao, the doctrine of objective value, overarches rulers and ruled alike. If you have the ruled who reject objective value, you have anarchy, chaos, you have revolution. If you have rulers who reject it, you have tyrannies, and you have the collapse of society any way you look at it. And Lewis says, I think in chapter 3, if you reject the Tao, you will have the collapse of a society. He says instead, the soul should be conformed to reality. And the way the ancients believed this would be done is through knowledge gained from study, knowledge gained from community, where people value objective reality and can debate with polarity proper, not polarization, and through self-discipline, because sometimes I'm willing to reject objective reality because I am compromised with my life. C.S. Lewis writes in his preface to Paradise Lost, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Aristotle, in a passage that Lewis refers to in the appendix of the Abolition of Man, says vice is unconscious of itself. He goes on to say, if I do a bad thing, I will begin to rationalize and justify that bad thing in order to live with myself. Aristotle calls it akrasia or akrasia, and it means to be without command of my moral life, to lose moral objectivity by virtue of my compromise. So consequently, it's not only the acquisition of knowledge, but the acquisition of self-discipline and the acquisition of virtue. Well, Lewis then moves on to this appendix, and he gives all these examples to show that this isn't a new idea with Lewis, and it's not merely a Western idea. It's not merely an idea percolating in England in 1943. It's something that has guided moral and just societies throughout history and has been compromised by societies when they go off the rails. So let's evaluate Lewis's argument first, and then let's apply it to beauty and to morality. First off, there was a man named Richard Weaver. He taught rhetoric at University of Chicago, and he wrote a book most people have heard of called Ideas Have Consequences. But he wrote a sequel to that book called The Ethics of Rhetoric. And in this particular book, Weaver talks about 4 kinds of arguments, and they become progressively less ethical. The first kind is the argument from definition. So a definition is a thing. It's an object of thought. He says that's the most ethical. And if I go off the rails, I can always go back to the original definition, reacquaint myself with it, and find out inferentially where I messed up. The second form of argument is from similitude. So the word definition literally means of the finite, de finis, of that which has ends. To define a thing, it has to be small enough for me to wrap words around it and distinguish it from other things. Well, how do you define God? If God's infinite, he breaks a category. And so we instead will say, well, as Jesus did, the kingdom of heaven is like, we use simile. Or as the scholastic philosophers and theologians argued, from the way of analogy. It's kind of like this. It's not as good as the argument of definition, but it's not bad when you can't quite define a thing fully. And then the third kind of ethical argument, which he feels is the absolute worst, is the argument from consequence. If you vote for my opponent in this next election, the whole world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. Watch in this next election time. Both sides do it. They'll tell you what will happen if their opponent is elected. You want them to argue from definition, to argue from fact, maybe even to argue from history, but history is an elusive argument. Because sometimes history is like similitude, sometimes history is manipulative. As soon as somebody says somebody's like Hitler, beware. They're moving towards the argument from consequence. You vote for my opponent in this next election, the whole world's going to fall apart. I don't know that. I remember hearing in elections, even about people I didn't necessarily vote for, that if that person won, then the whole world was going to fall apart. And that person won and the world didn't fall apart. You have to be careful. This is an argument not from reality. It's an argument from consequence, as Weaver calls it, and it tries to manipulate people to gain their vote, to drive them into fear, and for them no longer to be concerned about what the objective reality is, but just to assuage their fears. That's the least ethical form. Weaver adds a fourth form of argument. It's for the person who doesn't know how to argue at all. So they just quote somebody else, or they produce books like the quotable C.S. Lewis. That's a little joke. I did a book called The Quotable C.S. Lewis. But we quote somebody else rather than argue ourselves because we haven't yet learned how to lay down a good definition, argue inferentially, and come to a conclusion that is convincing. Okay, so if you took Weaver's four types of ethical argument and you evaluated Lewis's The Abolition of Man by it, hands down, chapter 1 is the best because it argues from definition. Chapter 2, interestingly enough, argues from similitude. What kinds of things might the authors of the Green Book be doing in order to try to validate their abuse? And he says they might do things like this. The third one, what would happen to the society if they rejected the Tao? Well, he says the whole society will fall apart. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. We have to see. Maybe a revival will take place. Maybe there will come in somebody who argues a point and convinces people, no, that's more robust, that's more rooted in reality. We just don't know what's going to happen. And then the last appendix, the last section, is quotes. It's all quotes. And interestingly enough, it breaks down perfect with Weaver's assessment in the Ethics of Rhetoric. Well, let's apply it to beauty. So C.S. Lewis said in his essay, De Futilitate, the issues related to argumentation relative to objective reality, to avoid subjectivism, to think about things as an objectivist. This can be applied to beauty and art as well. Now, we don't like this because I think most of us are anarchists when it comes to this issue. But I want you, KJ, for a moment, I want you to turn on everybody's sound. And I'm going to ask you all a question, and I want you to shout out your answer as soon as you see it. And I want everybody to hear. And then after a couple minutes, after 30 seconds, KJ, you can turn off all the sound again. Okay, can we do that? KJ, can you turn on everybody's sound? Huh?
The webinar function won't let me turn on their sound, Jerry.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. All right. Well, then I'll just do it without their sound. And here it is. I want you to answer this question as soon as you see the answer. How many squares are there? How many squares do you see? Did some of you say 16? Did some of you say 20? Did some of you say 17? Did some of you say 23, 24? We're all looking at the same thing, but we're coming up with different answers. I want to suggest to you that objectively, there are 30 squares there. You have the 16 little ones, the one big one. You have 17, that would be 18, 19, squares of 4, 20, 21, and in the middle, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. Then there are squares of 9, 27, 28, 29, and 30. We were all looking at the same thing, but we got different answers. The thing is, you go to a painting in an art museum, you go look at something in nature that maybe you don't understand about the trees or the cloud formations, and you've got the expert by you. That expert may see things you don't see. Expert opinion when it comes to art and beauty is valuable, but expert opinion is rooted in them understanding something of the reality of what we're looking at. It's objective in that regard. And Lewis makes a distinction in Reflections on the Psalms between two features of beauty, a subjective feature and an objective feature. The objective feature of beauty he simply calls admirable beauty. It's admirable in that it's there intrinsically in the thing itself, whether I perceive it or not. I may see 16 squares, and there may be a 30 square beauty before me. It's admirable. And consequently, somebody else could come along who understands the object better and point out the more squares. There's also the subjective response, which is the ability to emotionally and by virtue of trained sentiments appreciate the beauty that's there. And he calls that enjoyable beauty. That's subjective. You want to come to a place where it can be up to speed with the object. I'll give you an example of this, a negative example actually, and I'm embarrassed almost to share it. But I remember my wife one time took a class on Picasso. And I said to her after she came from her class, yeah, well, Claudia, Picasso was an idiot. She said, really? What do you know about Picasso? Well, I didn't know anything about him. So she responded and said, the first thing we have to do is decide who the real idiot is here. And then we have to see if that idiot is educable. So she took me to the Chicago Art Institute where they're having a big Picasso display. And we went through it and I go, oh my word. I spoke out of my ignorance. I spoke out of my subjective side without any appreciation for the objective reality. Claudia, I was so wrong. Years later, we went to Barcelona, Spain. We went to the Picasso Museum there, the greatest conglomeration of his art in one place. And we went through that place from his earliest days to his later days. We saw what he was trying to do. And it just took my breath away. He's still not my favorite artist, but he's one of my favorite artists. He's very, very good. And I had no idea. But when I had somebody who knew about Picasso and who learned from somebody who knew about Picasso, it took away my arrogance, it took away my ignorance, and it took away my justification of my ignorant arrogance. And so consequently, here's Lewis who's understanding how this object-subject relationship in art works. Well, if it is objective, then there must be some features in the thing itself that I could begin to abstract or generalize, because we want to be able to pass this on to other people. The expert could look at it and begin to talk about the work of art and describe it in a way so that they can show. So I'll give you an example. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica said, objects of beauty should have at least 3 characteristics. If they have 3, they could have 303. The more refined our understanding is, the better we can talk about these things. And also, the more honest we are, the less we should talk about them if we don't know what we're talking about. Instead, we should be listeners. But if we're interested, we should go find people who could teach us. Well, Aquinas said there should be integrity, there should be proportion, there should be clarity. So let's look at that. When you go to buy a Christmas tree, which tree do you buy? Do you buy that tree or do you buy the other tree? Now, if you're going to do a film on Charlie Brown's Christmas, you might buy the bottom one because it fits perfectly in your film. If you go to the Christmas tree lot and that's the last one, you buy it, but you put this part against the corner. Why do we buy this tree? Why do we buy that tree? Somebody says they don't buy neither. Maybe they buy pumpkins at Christmas. But anyway, why do we buy this tree? Why do we tend to? It's because we have an understanding of integrity of treeness. Maybe we've seen them in nature and we see how they grow. Maybe that is a result of abstraction or generalization because we're followers of Aristotle and we understand how he explains it. Or maybe we picked it up from something transcendent breaking through and we're followers of Plato and we see how they explain it. Plato and Aristotle explain things differently, but they see the reality is there and they're trying to understand it. We look for the thing that seems to have integrity. But as soon as somebody says that, then we see there's creative ways for the artist to explain or demonstrate integrity, things that we might not have thought of as lay people. I think about the painting. You should look it up, write it down, and look it up later. Nude descending a staircase by Duchamp. I think it came out in 1902 or 1905. Some have considered it the first work of modern art. It's one of my favorite paintings. It doesn't look anything like a nude, but what Duchamp captured in that painting was the concept of movement, of descent, and it has integrity in that regard. Duchamp, movie films had just started coming out, and he started overlaying frames of the camera on a picture of somebody descending a staircase, and he tried to capture that in a single frame in his painting. It's a wonderful painting. Another thing is proportion. I remember when I was in first grade, we had to draw a book, you know, the All About Me book you do in first grade, and you draw your own picture, and it's just your head on the one page. It's just swollen because you're so narcissistic, self-referential. You're the biggest thing in your world. The next page, you draw your parents, and they're about half page each. Then you had to draw your brothers and sisters, and they look like ants on the next page. And then I go to the teacher, I say, I'm done, teacher. And she said, draw something else, Jerry. I said, what should I draw? She said, draw something you like. So I drew an airplane. I like airplanes. I went to her, I said, teacher, I'm done. What should I draw? She says, Jerry, there's still more time. Draw something else you like. So I drew 3 airplanes. I wasn't very creative, 3 airplanes. Then I said, teacher, I'm done. I should draw something else, huh? And she said, yeah, there's still time. So what do I draw? I went and drew a clock. And my clock looked something like that. I got the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Uh-oh, what do I do with 11 and 12? It's bad art. There's not good proportion there. And so consequently, I was trying to make something out of it, and I ran out of space. We look for proportion. But as soon as we think we understand that, some creative artist comes up and uses proportion in a unique way. And we say, wow, these artists, these creative people can do remarkable things. Here's what Picasso did once. You know what that is? It's actually somebody sitting down. But look how he only used 3 sides of the canvas and let the imagination fill in the rest. That's proportion that makes it work. And then clarity. What kind of day do you prefer? Do you prefer a sheet of gray in the sky? Maybe on a spring day when the flowers are starting to burst out, you might like that exactly because you have had your winter and you want to focus not on the sky, but on the bursting of the flowers, the daffodils, the forsythia, the tulips as they start to bloom, and the rhododendron and so on, the azaleas. You want to focus on the ground, but it's not because of the beauty of the sky on that day. Maybe there's another day where the sky is a sheet of blue. You prefer the blue over the gray. But maybe there's another day where it's a canvas of blue and it's got all these billowy clouds that give texture to the sky. And maybe you have one of those days where the leading edge towards the sun of the clouds is a ribbon of gold. And then it is brilliant white. And then it's dove. And then it's ivory. And then it's gray in the trailing side. Or maybe you catch it at a sunset where you almost want to weep because it takes your breath away when you look at it. What is it that does this to us? It's usually, according to Thomas Aquinas, the brightness and the color and so on. Anyway, that's how this argument from Lewis could be applied. That's just a very simple sketch. You could build on it. And again, if Aquinas has those 3 elements, those 3 abstractions, you could maybe develop 100. And it would be a good exercise to do. Lastly is morality. How do we judge moral issues? The 2 authors that Lewis quotes most in the appendix of The Abolition of Man are Aristotle, the common sense philosopher, and Confucius's Analects, where he does almost in Eastern thought what Aquinas or Aristotle does in Western thought. Basically, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics says that what is the end to which we all aspire? There must be an end if we're moving towards something. And he says the end we aspire to is a happy life. If you're a Christian, you might say the God-glorifying life. These can be in some ways synonymous. But when he says happy life, he doesn't mean circumstantially happy. He thinks the happy life is when I've lived my life. I can't judge it a happy life 5 minutes into it, any more than I could judge if it's a good football game 5 minutes into the game. You don't judge a football game until maybe 5-10 minutes before it's over. And it's not a good game if it's a slaughter. It's a good game when both teams were well prepared and equal in their match, and you saw it hard fought and the strategies and so on at play. So too, we judge a good life by a life that has been well lived. And it's not merely circumstantially happy, it's one where we see the good life is manifesting itself at the end of our days. And Aristotle says the good life is a life when all of my basic needs are met. And my basic needs are not arbitrary. They're determined by my nature, my human nature. As a matter of fact, if I know what is good for me, I know what's good for others who share my nature. And I should try to cultivate a culture that would be best for all to have the opportunity to live a good life. So you have physical needs. I need shelter. I need food. I need drink. You have sociological needs. I need to love and be loved. I want to live a life where I am able to live in a sociologically peaceful society. So I want a politically healthy society as well. Lewis, interestingly enough, says you can tell sick people because they always talk about health. You can tell a sick society because it always talks about its politics. If a society is running well, we don't have to do that. And so consequently, if my world is running well politically, I sense the peace and the tranquility, the goodwill of men towards men and women towards women, and a society towards one another, racially, economically, between employer and employee. Morale is good. And then also we have spiritual needs, and these need to be met as well. And if I'm neglecting my spiritual needs to pursue merely materialistic interests, I'm not living a good life. And so consequently, sometimes I can want more than I need. I can pursue those things that Jesus said, moth and rust destroy, thieves break in and steal. And I'm going to end up at the end of my life disappointed because I've put my ladder up against the wrong wall. Or I can be lazy and want too much sleep and not go do the work I need to do in order to earn the money so that I can have a roof over my head and food and provide for my family and give them the sociological security of knowing that they'll be taken care of. And on it goes. And so Aristotle says, therefore, as Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, we need to pursue virtue. Virtue is an integrated whole, which is the habitual ability to suffer pain and hardship. It's endurance, fortitude, and staying power. Courage is the ability to do the right thing, even in the teeth of pain. We need to pursue temperance, which is the habitual ability to resist the enticement of the immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater, though more remote good. And his courage is the ability to say yes to right action in the teeth of pain. Temperance says no to wrong action, even in the jaws of pleasure. I need to pursue justice. That's also a characteristic of virtue. Justice is to render to others their due, to seek to cultivate a secure society, and a society that secures and protects natural rights. It's just, it's fair. And then also wisdom. And wisdom is a habit of being concerned about decisions I make. It seeks counsel. It seeks advice. It seeks the kinds of books that give me insight, like The Abolition of Man, to help me understand my own time, the benefits of polarity, but the abuses of polarization. A book that helps me to also understand how I might apply its arguments to things like beauty and elevate then the quest for beauty in my own life and the benefits that brings me as I enjoy beauty around me. And also as I cultivate the habits of virtue and character and moral endeavor. I can say to a person objectively, if they're lazy, you shouldn't be lazy. It's just keeping you from the good life. If they're living a profligate life, if they're abusing people and taking advantage of other people and devaluing the humanity of that other person just to gain advantage from them, I can tell them why that's not going to be good for them in the long run, and how their own humanity, when they deny the humanity of another's, atrophies in the process. It's all embedded in the wisdom that Lewis has in this book. Well, anyway, I think that's probably enough. Maybe we could open up for question and answer. And by the way, in the question and answer time, I don't know a lot of the answers. There's something arbitrary about Q&A times because people ask questions. I've read these authors. I've read The Abolition of Man. I lost track at 50 times reading that book. But the thing is, though, just because you've read it that many times, it doesn't mean you can't find something new on the 51st or 52nd read, or somebody else saw it, only read it twice, and they saw something you didn't see. I'm going to answer the questions as best I can, but I don't want to project myself as some know-it-all. I'm not.
Okay, well, I have some questions here, and I'll start off with one that I get from time to time if I'm talking about C.S. Lewis to a group. Was C.S. Lewis distrustful of science?
No, he was not. He was a great appreciator of science, but he was opposed to scientism, the religion of science, that began to so root itself down into a scientific perspective that it didn't have an interest in the more robust human approach to life that would include empirical endeavors, but also saw the humanities, the arts, saw the social sciences, and so on. I had a student years ago. She came to visit my class, a C.S. Lewis class I was teaching. She was from Brown University, very bright, obviously. And I met her. She was an atheist. And she came to talk to me about her atheism with a friend of hers who was a Christian. And I said, wow, you go to Brown, you must be very bright. What are you studying there? She said, biochemistry. I said, wow, it's a challenging major. That's very, very interesting to me. But she came to this class today about C.S. Lewis. What do you think about spiritual things? And she said, well, frankly, as a biochemist, which I thought was a little bit immature on her judgment because she was only a sophomore, but she's already claiming to be a biochemist. It's amazing to me. But I said, okay, as a biochemist, she said, I live by the principle, if I can't perceive it empirically, I just don't buy it. I said, really? The principle you live by is if you can't perceive it empirically, you won't buy it. She said, yes. I said, would you please set forth that principle empirically for me? Well, she was a bright student and she saw the contradiction in her own presupposition. Her presupposition was just that. It was a rational principle, a presupposition. It was a wrong rational principle. And consequently, it wasn't something she perceived empirically. It was something she grasped intellectually. And so she freaks out. She was bright. She got it. She says, why, everybody at Brown University believes this. I never saw the incongruity and the inconsistency in my own view. And I said, no, not everybody at Brown University believes that. There are Christians at Brown teaching there too. You'd be surprised. They get everywhere. Plus, let's be honest, not all empiricists and not all scientists would hold that view that if you can't perceive it empirically, you just don't believe it. They're married, they have relations with their children and so on, and they understand about love and these sorts of things. I said, don't get me wrong, John Polkinghorne, who was a physicist and theologian at Cambridge University, he once said, if you ask the scientist, why is the kettle boiling? The scientist would say, heat from the burners agitating the molecules and causing it to boil at 100 degrees centigrade. And you could do that experiment over and over again and get the same result. But another answer to the question, why is the kettle boiling, could be, Polkinghorne said, I want a cup of tea, and would you like one too? By mere scientific investigation, you could never give the second answer. And Mortimer Adler, the philosopher at University of Chicago, said, in 4 generations, we've gone from saying that which is measurable is that which is significant for science, to saying that which is measurable is the only thing that's significant. And Lewis was opposed to that kind of scientism that closed itself down and then prided itself that it knew so much, when really it was just shutting itself in.
Mm-hmm.
And in a university, we have 4 divisions. We have the sciences. I'm grateful for them. And I'm grateful for what the engineers have done to apply the sciences. So living in cold Wheaton, Illinois, I don't have to go out to an outhouse in the middle of the winter. I've got hydraulics and plumbing in my house. I like the sciences, but that's only 1/4 of the discussion in the university campus. You have the social scientists, and they can begin to assess what the culture is thinking. And they can by virtue of analysis and statistical studies come up with these things. But those statistics only last for a brief time because cultures are fluid. So I want the social scientists because they're always going to be needful. And then I want the fine arts that show us what Tolkien says. We're made in the image of a creator, and we love the arts. And we love engaging them even if we're not professionals, because there's something recreative about them. And then I love the humanities, history, literature, and philosophy, to help me understand the ideas that have so shaped humanity throughout the centuries. G.K. Chesterton said somebody who's ensconced in their own time is unjustly disinherited because they have lost the benefits of the past wisdom. So that's what I would tell a person. Lewis believed he did not have disdain for science. He saw it as a valid part of the university. He had disdain for the scientism that says their perspective is the only perspective. That's polarization, or not polarization. That's polarization. Digging in at your point of view and not listening to others.
So someone is asking about Lewis's comments about the trait of betrayal, saying the trait of betrayal was never admired in any culture. So this person is asking, did he actually research to see if betrayal was valued in any culture?
Well, Don Richardson, who wrote his book, The Peace Child, who talked about how being a traitor was valued in some of these cultures in Papua New Guinea. Lewis never lived to read that book. But even Don Richardson said to those cultures that honored betrayal, if they were in war with each other, how did they ever make peace? They had to recognize that if they lived in the midst of betrayal, they would eventually annihilate one another. And so even in that culture where there was an honor of betrayal, it only went so far. And Lewis, when you say, did he do research? Lewis is a guy, I mean, to write the English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, like I said, he read every book published in the 16th century to write that book. And that's just one century. Lewis's reading, it just blows my mind constantly, the things that he's familiar with. You read, again, The Neglected C.S. Lewis, and you read these books that he's familiar with. This guy had a vast range. Did he read everything that was written? Absolutely not. All of us are pea brains, even Lewis. Go to the Widener Library at Harvard, 19 million volumes under that one roof was readable. All of us have levels of deficiency. But if we're going to do a comparative work, I would say Lewis is less deficient than most of us by virtue of the breadth.
I was struck by reading The Abolition of Man, again, this time by his sense of that there are certain principles that are intuitive, and they're basic principles. They can't be argued to; they can only be argued from.
Yeah.
And I think some of these moral principles he sees as just intuitively. I mean, he can illustrate them from other cultures, but it's not because he's trying to. He says that actually, he's not trying to prove them by sort of.
If nothing is self-evident, nothing can be proved, he says in The Abolition of Man.
Yeah.
And you go to Romans chapter 2, and Paul begins that way in the first about third of that chapter. He says that if the person does not have the Bible, they still have objective reality. I know that I don't want you to treat me poorly, Bill. And you know that I don't want you don't want me to treat you poorly, because we share the same nature. And in sharing that nature, we know what hurts us and we know what encourages us. We want to cultivate a society where we minimize the hurt and we maximize the encouragement. And that's objective.
So,
by the way, Aristotle comes up with a form of ethics that's not far from the New Testament ethics. The problem isn't, do people have knowledge of these things in the secular society before the time of Christ? They had knowledge of them. They understood the principles, and they understood that people came short of the principles. What they didn't understand was that there was a way to be forgiven and to be benefited by the workings of the Holy Spirit and Christian community, that we could find a way out of the hole we had dug for ourselves. So that's what.
So some atheists today say that we can be good without God. Why do we need the whole concept of God? What do you think Lewis would say to the question, can we be good without God?
He wrote an essay on it called Man or Rabbit, and I would encourage people to go read that. He said, could we have ethics without Christianity, or could we be good without God, basically? And Lewis says the problem is, if anybody's honest, I don't know an honest person who could say, I've lived my life utterly perfectly. I have, I believe in the high ideal of love, but I've had sharp words with people I say I love most in the world. I believe in justice, and there have been times I've been unfair in my treatment of others. And almost without exception. As a matter of fact, I've had conversations with thousands and thousands of people about these issues. And I don't know anybody, when I brought that point up, I believe in the high ideal of love, but I've had sharp words with people I say I love most. All of them start shaking their head. Yeah, we know we've screwed up. So as soon as we acknowledge that, our own deficiencies and so on, now we can have an honest discussion. Can you have ethics without God? Well, not when I'm God. If I'm playing God, my ethics don't fare well. And those around me don't fare well either. You want to live with a person who thinks that they're perfect? I knew a man once. I met a religious man once, and he said, I haven't sinned in 15 years. He said it. I heard him say it. I looked at his wife. She looked horrible. If she ever has an argument with him, guess who's always wrong? He hasn't sinned in 15 years. Can you imagine the arrogance of living with a person who thinks they're above the fray? I think if a person's honest, then all of a sudden they start scratching around. What do I do about the deficiencies? Where do I go? Who can help me? And all of a sudden we start becoming interested in what Jesus called the good news, the gospel. That there is forgiveness, that God loves us. He pursues us. He wants to reconcile us to himself. And God proved his love for us, and while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us.
So one question that I also wondered about was the connection between the abolition of man and that hideous strength.
Yes.
So could you comment on some of the correlation between?
You could probably comment on it as well as I you know these things as well or better than I do. But that hideous strength, Lewis would often write a book in propositional form where he set forth an idea, and then he would develop it imaginatively in a book of fiction. So in the Four Loves, you've got him talking propositionally about the nature of love, and then he shows how it works out in his novel, Till We Have Faces, where we see the abuses of love and the benefits of love and so on. You've got, even in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, a rather propositional approach to his own development and coming to conversion. But he's got something imaginatively portrayed in The Pilgrim's Regress, the allegorical apology of Christianity, reason, and romanticism. The abolition of man is a propositional statement about the things we've been talking about, and the Till We Have that hideous strength then is basically a depiction of chapter 3, what this world would look like if you had a group of people come up and thought they could be self-referential, they didn't have to submit to objective reality, and they could create it, and they become tyrannical. Eventually, they destroy themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another good question would be, related to how, so Lewis, was writing in the 1940s. And since that time, so he's starting to see, it seems like the beginning of how technology and science is gaining more and more control, and how would you see the insights that he had, how they've developed so that today technology has such a huge place, in our lives and defining who we are and our identity and, these kinds of things?
Well, he goes back further than that. He writes about these things you can read about in The Discarded Image, where he talks about the fact that science was coming up in an age where also people were concerned about magic. And each of them had the same goal, to find out some way to control things. If I can control my environment at one level scientifically, maybe I could produce more crops. That's not a bad thing necessarily. But the magic person was trying to do this too. If I sacrifice these people, maybe the rains will come, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So science was coming up, but it was always an attempt to control. That may not be bad. There may be some things that are worth controlling. But you have to be able to say if it's worth controlling, you must have an objective standard by which to validate that. Because if you put in the hands of people these tools to control, and the people themselves have no self-control, then they begin to use that in an evil technological war to end all wars, World War I, which wasn't the war to end all wars. But we saw these kinds of technological advances even in the Civil War, in the Crimean War, where they were finally able to train troops and they could move troops fast and things. Their cannonades were more efficient and so on. And throughout history, though, you had this. You go from the crossbow to from the longbow to the crossbow to the gun to the cannon. We've always had these technological things. And usually what happens is the technology advances beyond human virtue. And when it does, you have calamity. You still always have the need to rein in spiritually the human soul, which has a propensity to go wrong. And you could go back even to Plato's Republic, where he talks about the ring of Gyges, which gave Gyges the power of invisibility, and how immediately it corrupts them. And then centuries later, millennia later, Tolkien writes about the same thing in The Lord of the Rings. Even when people imagined absolute power, what did they do with it when they got it? It corrupted them. So I think that Lewis is aware of this, but people have been aware of it for a long, long time.
Okay. Someone's asking here about, could you speak more on virtue and the ability to endure pain and suffering, particularly when we seem to live in a time when the avoidance or the numbing of pain and suffering is what is pursued? So it's kind of, our day is maximize pleasure, avoid pain and suffering.
Yeah. Well, we all have pain in our life. It's a fallen, broken world to one degree or another, some more so and some less. And our approaches can be to anesthetize the pain artificially, deaden the pain so we don't feel it, or else endure the pain and try and figure out what caused it. If it was something in our early development, something in our childhood, we need to learn to grieve the love we weren't given. We need to learn to forgive the people who hurt us so we can untether from those events. They may be long dead and buried, but they control us if we've given them control by living our life in reaction to those events. Grieving and forgiving is the key. And the thing is, if you don't have the power to grieve and forgive, then you need to know the love of God that gives you a context in which you can grieve and be heard and understood. And also you need to know the forgiveness of God so that you could draw on that rich reservoir to forgive somebody else. If you have a bad habit and you're drinking too much or you're using drugs, you maybe need to put yourself in the context of people who could help you get through those addictions. And probably if they're anesthetizing deep brokenness, help you walk through how to fix that, how to get better. And then you need to learn the habit of temperance. And again, temperance is not abstinence. Temperance is learning the art of right amount, right place, right time. It's learning how to manage pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And courage is the ability to manage pain. Not all pain is bad. An athlete wanting to win a championship doesn't curse the coach because the coach drives them. The coach knows what it takes to the coach knows what it takes to win championships. So consequently, also, if every time I feel a little pain, I go take a drug to deaden the pain, or if I feel some relational pain, I avoid the relationship or something like that. I need to grow in courage, and all of us need to grow in these areas. None of us put it together. But the perfect love casts out fear, the scriptures say. I need to lather up more and more in the love of God so that I could reduce the amount of fear. And perfect love comes from Jesus, really. Human love is great as far as it goes, and it can go far, but human love can't do for us at the depths that only the love of Jesus and the forgiveness of Jesus can do for us.
Someone wants to know, did Lewis think beauty was a moral category?
Did Lewis think what?
Beauty is a moral category.
I would suggest to you that if you could render to a thing its due, and that's justice, to live without a desire to cultivate beauty is to be unjust. Yeah. So it would be a moral category, and it would be to my harm more than anything else. I think God made us to enjoy beauty. Matter of fact, when we get to heaven, we're going to be before the throne of God, and I think it's going to blow our minds away perpetually. Mm-hmm. Why not cultivate a sensitivity to that sort of thing now? You know, but if you're standing and you see a bunch of people and they're facing westward, you go, what are those people looking at? You look westward and you see the most glorious sunset you've ever seen in your life. And you start looking at it and the tears start to come down your eyes. It's so beautiful. It's captured you so much. And you turn to another guy who just walks up and you say, look at that. And he says, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. We laugh at the incongruity of the statement because he's being unjust. He's not rendering to a thing its due. One of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life are the northern lights, and reds and blues and greens and whites. And it just totally took my breath away. I was there with some students. We were up by Lake Superior at Wheaton College's Northwoods campus, Honey Rock, and these things came out and we did the only thing that seemed appropriate. We stood on the ski dock and for 2.5 hours, we sang hymns of praise and adoration to God for the beauty that he had given us that day. So yes, I think it has a moral feature to it. It's to render to a thing its due. If I go through an art museum and I say, this is a bunch of junk, then in doing that, I am showing an injustice in me. I'll give you another example, quick one. Can I say Prague is the most beautiful city in the world? No, because I haven't been to every city in the world. So the statement is an unjust statement. It's untrue. It's inaccurate. Can I say Prague is the most beautiful city I've ever seen? Well, it depends on what cities I've seen. That city's going to, if that statement's going to be meaningful. If I say, well, I've seen Barstow, California. If you're here from Barstow, I don't mean to demean the place where you live, but it's not a beautiful place. But if I say, I've seen Cape Town, South Africa, I've seen Seattle, I've seen Quebec City, I've seen Salzburg, and I just start going down the list of these incredible cities I've seen. And now I say Prague's the most beautiful one I've ever seen. It has some merit, but now you can ask me, how do you define beauty and how do you apply it to a city? If I can't do that, then I have been unjust in my statement because it hasn't been true. But if I can define beauty and apply it to a city, it has merit. Otherwise, I'm just simply reduced to saying, I like Prague. But if I say, all I can say is I like Prague because I haven't done the hard work of studying how beauty works and applies these things and so on and be taken in by it, then if I haven't done that work and I try to make you like it because of my simple liking it, that's unjust also because I'm coercive. And that's inappropriate.
Well, thank you, Jerry. This some very helpful insights this evening. We have about another 15 or 16 questions, but obviously we don't have time to get to them all. So thanks to all of you for your interest. And
well, here's the thing, if they want to email me at jerry.root@wheaton.edu, Jerry with a J, .root@wheaton.edu, send me the question with your phone number, and I'll call you back and talk about it. I won't type it to you because I type too slow.
So you won't write a
Happy to do
personal letter like Lewis did?
Yeah, well, it'll be, no, I type too slow. He didn't type at all. But-
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Well-
I can call and I can talk to you. If you're
Oh.
calling from Australia or something, like I just know if you're from Australia, you're from the city, I mean, you're from the country where my grandfather was born. But otherwise I could call you.
Well, thanks, Jerry. That's very gracious of you to do that. So, thanks again for this evening. I know just having read the book again myself, I was impressed with the concept of men without chess, but education that doesn't train young people to value things that are good, true, and beautiful.
Yeah.
And when that happens, and the substitution of the innovators, or people who come along and substitute other things, which they then use various means to train us, and it ends up. I was thinking of like a consumer society where we're being trained constantly to want certain things, to desire certain things, so that now they can be provided for us by the consumer society. And of course, those desires can never be totally satisfied, because then the consumer, then the whole process begins to break down.
Well, so you could go about it this way though too. Somebody could say, well, what right do you have to tell me what's beautiful? What right do you have to tell me what's morally good? As opposed to saying, well, you seem to have some convictions about this. How did you arrive at those convictions?
So to have a conversation.
One is to be teachable. The other one is to say, I'm stuck where I'm at. That's polarization. I'm stuck at my pole. I don't want to hear anything else.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, I think that's where health comes.
Well, so next month, I encourage all of you to join us again and to read The Great Divorce, and that'll certainly be fun. It's always fun to read that book. So many good dialogues and such in there. So, Jerry, thanks for your time.
It's not about marriage.
It's not about marriage. That's right. Okay. And so again, thanks to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And good evening.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you.